Budget meeting. First, I'll start with the land acknowledgement. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are Mi'kma'ki and the district of Spaganagity and the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. East Hants further acknowledges the 50 African Nova Scotian communities whose 400-year history have contributed to the province's culture, history, and legacies. We are all treaty people. All right, I'll be looking for the approval of the agenda or amendments to the agenda. Moved? Seconded? All those in favor? Aye. Approval of the minutes of February 22nd, 2024. Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. All right. D, transfer tax report number 4, CAO.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just make this big enough to see. So, councillors, based on discussion at our last few budget meetings, you have a D-transfer tax report number 4 in front of you. This report is a follow-up to the discussions that you've held throughout January and February. It outlines some of what I believe Council has sort of settled on and made some assumptions that some of the things you've settled on include your increase in your D-transfer tax budget from that $2.1 million to the $3 million for 2024, and then some of the policy changes that would be required to sort of cement that in your future budgets, budget drafts, I should say. Anything in the policy that we're recommending is just on how staff would be expected to draft a budget in years coming and not tying any future council to having to do one or other of these things. We also, in the report, looked at the operating grants that are currently in place from the general tax rate. So up to this point, we've been focusing primarily on the D-transfer tax grant to the urban service rate, which is really funded from the general tax rate. And there are 2 others that one would be the rural fire department, or the smaller fire department operating grants. And then there's a small grant that's awarded to the East Hants Sportsplex of $10,000 that was put in place years ago when that rate first came in place. And sort of the justification that other folks from East Hants do use the facility. So council of the day had a grant of $10,000 awarded. You know, that was several years ago now, and although $10,000 is a lot of money in the grand scheme of that one particular area rate, it's not a lot of money at this point. So I did look at a lot of different scenarios in the report, and I'm going to take you through some of the data that we were able to put together for you. Really, it's some of the data that we already had in some of our reports earlier with additional parameters with them. And then we took a look at all of the tax burden per district across the municipality, because I think if you're looking at what to do with the 2 cents that you're going to gain on that general tax rate from the general fund, from the D-transfer tax increase, I think you need to understand the significant tax burden that we have throughout East Hants and how that 2 cents could make a difference on some of those folks, or part of that 2 cents. So I do have some recommendations, but I'll come back to those once we go through the report. And again, the recommendations are really just to start that conversation happening. I know it's difficult to take all the numbers and all the scenarios and whatnot and sort of synthesize those in your own head. So I thought if I made a recommendation that I think I've heard around the table would work. I've heard things like we don't want folks to double dip. We don't want to take the urban service rate grant away, but we want to make sure that folks who are paying into that general tax rate are getting something back from the D-transfer tax, those types of comments. So what I tried to do in my recommendation is sort of pull that information and hopefully put something on the table that you folks can start with. So when we look at the general tax rate discussion, this is really what I'm making the assumption that you have 2 cents to work with on your general tax rate. So the reports of January recommended that you increase your budget for D-transfer tax You take some of that money and set it aside in a municipal buildings and properties reserve. And then what council had asked is that we take 2 cents and we use it to help this budget in particular. The equivalent of 2 cents on your general tax rate. So if you did nothing right now and you just decided, okay, we're just going to increase that transfer tax budget, and then everybody's going to get a 2 cent decrease on their tax rate, that could happen with the money that you have on the table. The policy change recommendations here are ones that I think you need to, for the benefit of staff and for succession, you know, as directors and managers of finance change, you're going to need direction to be given. I think you need to add to your budget management policy how you want draft budgets to come to you as far as the transfer tax number, because it's a fairly large number. And then how much of that would be allocated to the municipal buildings and property reserve, because you're always going to have a need for funds in that reserve, and borrowing for those amounts isn't always recommended because sometimes they're not large amounts, they're just amounts that council needs to sustain our operations. So as far as operating grants go, I know we've been focused on the transfer tax to the urban service rate. But when I looked across the municipality and our budgets, there are 2 other grants, as I mentioned. One is the fire operating grants. Those are general tax rate dollars that are given to the fire departments that have lower assessments than $94 million. When we first sort of cemented this in policy, those were $75 million worth of assessment. But as the assessments have grown, we increased that, that sort of assessment base up to $94 million. As does the grant grow. So it was back in that time, it had been in place for a number of years, but when we put it into policy, I believe it was $8,600, and it has since grown to $11,500 per department that you see on the screen. There is one other fire department that we fund, that is the Brooklyn Fire Department. It's not actually within the boundaries of East Hants, but there are some folks who are serviced by that department that pay area rates to Brooklyn as well. These 6 departments get $11,500 a year, equal across the board. So that's not actually, it's an equivalent of 2 cents for the rural fire departments or the smaller fire departments. But it's not an equal 2 cents across the board, because each one of them has assessments that raises more or less for that 1 cent. As I mentioned, the East Hants Sportsplex, there is a $10,000 allotment that gets paid every year to the Sportsplex area rate. That was put in place a number of years ago. I meant to go back and check the date, but it's probably been at least 8 or 9 years that was put in place, and it might have been even back in the day, more like 15 years. And then, which is the grant that's been a topic of great debate over the last few weeks, is the urban service rate grant. So I did do a history here of the urban service rate grant, and I went back and looked at all the motions around that. Really, a grant started in 2003, 2004. At that time, the corridor didn't have an urban service rate, but it was paid out to the sidewalk rates of the day, because we were building sidewalks, and those rates were fairly high back in the day. So in recognition of the tax burdens on those folks in that corridor area from Enfield to Lance, this grant was awarded. And back then it was 50% of the transfer tax collected. And back then we were collecting $490,000 in transfer tax. So it was a significant amount of that tax collected. Over the years, it went up and up and up to that, probably the max was $497. And then in 2011, that's when council said, once your transfer tax, similar to what we're seeing now, but it's over the $3 million mark, once it was over that $1 million mark, it was, well, this is an exception. Oh, we did it again. Oh, look. And by the time you get into a few years of that, council said, okay, well, let's make it a maximum of 40% up to $1 million of transfer tax. So at that point, that year, it was actually 32% of the tax. And now we're down come to, so the little 3 dots just mean that it was the same, the 400,000 was awarded every year. The 2023-2024 budget, we have a D-transfer tax grant of 430, and that's that CPI increase that you granted last year, and that would be 13% of the budget for 2023-2024. So when I looked at ways to allocate the 2 cents, I made some assumptions. So I made the assumption that council doesn't want to remove the operating grants you currently have in place, either to the fire departments or to the urban service rate or to the $10,000 to the sportsplex. I also made an assumption based on council's expressing a desire to provide some sort of grant to those who don't get a similar grant to the operating grants, but that know that there are pressures on their districts, either from a tax burden perspective or from a growth perspective. So when you look at areas in Mount Uniacke, those councillors have for years been saying, you know, we need things like recreation facilities, sidewalks, all of those things. And typically you would have an area rate that pays for those. This grant could be awarded to those districts to sort of set them up for success when they start to go down some of those project routes, especially if they don't have a volunteer base that is going to take on some of those projects. Like we've had here in the corridor, you've had the folks who sort of the volunteers built the sportsplex, that type of thing. But depending on what happens in Mount Uniacke, you may not have that volunteer base, and you may need some of this money to fund some of that startup or seed activity for those projects. And then when we look at across the board, you know, I couldn't do this report without talking about the tax burden across the municipality. So one of our mappers did up a map of each district, and when we look at, and the exercise was one of mapping our last year's final tax bill without things like the waste management fee or the water utility bills. So when you looked at the tax burden across the municipality, tax burdens in the urban core and suburban areas of Mount Uniacke are contributing significantly more per dwelling than other areas of the municipality, those outside the corridor serviced area and the northern area of East Hants. So to this end, I thought it was important that we look at ways to also reduce the overall tax burden for everybody in East Hants across the board. You know, you've got your assessments are increasing by CPI at a minimum in most cases, but then you have folks who are paying significant amounts of D-transfer tax, buying new homes, and then paying a significant amount of tax over and above what their neighbors pay because they're living in those homes that don't have capped assessments. So, you know, that is a reality of our tax system. It's very difficult to change that. The provincial government's not going to move on that. So I think this council has to eventually figure out ways to sort of work with the CAP program and spread some of that burden out between those who are in the program and those who are not. I'm going to come back to the scenarios. I want to talk a little bit about the data, just to remind you of all of some of the data and to bring out the new stuff that we've collected over the last few days. So this is the breakdown of general tax revenue by area, and some of these numbers have been updated just based on the discussions. So if you look at the general tax revenue with the commercial, resource, and residential, we have about $25 million in tax. About 20 of that is from resource and residential. When you look at where that money is collected, you've got the corridor urban service rate is about 42%. Outside of the urban service rate, but still in those districts from 1 to 10, or 1 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 10, is about 3.8 million. Rural East Hants, the 3 districts, 5, 6, and 11, is 3.4 million, and UNIAC is 4.3 million. And then this is some of the information that we added to this report. So if you look at the tax dollars per dwelling unit, in your corridor urban service area with those with wastewater, you've got about $2,400 per dwelling unit is the amount of general tax collected. In UNIAC, it's $2,100. The corridor, it's $1,300, and rural is $1,100. We've talked a lot about growth over the last number of years, so I thought I would put this table in here. So what we did is we went back 8 years, and really going back, we were going to do 10, but 10 you get into different districts back before 2016, because that was our last boundary review. So if you go back to 8 years, you've got consistent data across the board. And what we showed here was sort of where the growth is happening across East Hants. So if you look at, we've had $925 million worth of assessment growth over the last 8 years, and the breakdown of where that growth has happened is on the table. So the lion's share is in the urban service rate area. The next would be UNIAC, and then there's the growth just outside of the serviced corridor section, and then northern East Hants is 15%. Commercial is a little bit skewed because you've got the two business parks that are in Mount UNIAC and Elmsdale, so those certainly get skewed there. That's not all of our business commercial assessment is in those two parks, but a lion's share of it does, of the growth especially, has come from those two parks. You certainly have other areas, though, that are growing, and we see that pockets outside, and you have places like the Milford Industrial Park that is certainly growing as well. But generally, that's why those two numbers are skewed towards UNIAC and Elmsdale. And then we have the number of dwelling units that have grown over the last 8 years. We're looking at about 500 in the urban service rate, 236 in UNIAC, 197 in the corridor, and then 196 in the northern areas of East Hants. So the D-transfer tax by area and by number of transactions. This is a report that shows basically the last, all the times we've presented this information in particular to you. We haven't done the bottom one in the past, but the first table, we've always just had the corridor area because it was difficult to split them up. I went through each transaction from last year and found them on the map and went through to figure out which ones were urban service rate, which ones were the corridor other, which ones were, and then UNIAC and the northern district sort of split themselves out quite nicely by district. So this just shows, before it was showing like 63% coming from the corridor. This breaks that down to show that 41% comes from the urban service rate area, 22% from outside of that, but still in the corridor, 12% from the northern districts, and then 25% from UNIAC. Breaking that down one more step, each of those breakdowns, I thought it would be handy to show the average transaction amount per transaction. Now, these are averages, so there's some that are, it's truly the total divided by the number of. And you'll see the corridors are, I would say, significantly higher per transaction than those in the northern regions or in the UNIAC regions. Interesting information that we've never looked at before. So when we look at tax burden by district, I wanted to have this conversation and show this information because I think it's important that each of you understand the burden that's being felt by your residents when you're deciding whether you should reduce your general tax rate or not. So again, these are the final tax bills from last year, from 2023. And it was a bit of a mapping exercise. So we took the tables from the final tax bill, and what Tippy did is she went in and she she plugged in the total values for each one of the properties that she had a civic unit on, and there was residential assessment on it. So that's what you're seeing here. And you start to see sort of a heat map of, this is, for example, Councillor Garden Cole's district. You start to see sort of the blues would be the lower, less than $2,000 per year for a tax bill. You'll see there's not all that many in Enfield. Most of what you're going to see in Enfield would be sort of those $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 tax bills. And then you see some $6,000 tax bills, which in some cases are apartment buildings, but in some cases are new homes that don't have the cap and are paying on our tax rate. So you can see sort of a general idea of what types of tax burdens are on these properties. And then I took each one of those and sort of put them into a table so you can see where those burdens actually lie by the number of units. Now, this exercise isn't perfect because it sort of marries our assessment system and our mapping system. So each one of these is a few dwelling units off because it's only taking, so if there's an apartment building, for example, it only takes that as one account, one property, not 80 dwelling units. So in Enfield's case, some of these are actually apartment buildings that they have several dwelling units attached to them, and they've got that higher than $6,000 tax bill. So for each one of the districts, and you can all look at your own in more detail, you can start to see where there's three interesting districts in East Hants. One is in the Elmsdale district, which is Councillor Mitchell's district. So this is where we are now in Elmsdale. You start to see some more expensive tax burdens in the corridor, but when you look out in the Belnan Garden Meadows subdivision, you start to see a lot of these $4,000, $5,000, and $6,000 tax bills, and those are single-family dwellings. The reason you see that, and you'll see it in any of your districts that have new homes, is that these folks don't have large caps on their property. So they're paying market rates on their homes, and they've got a lot of sales in that area. So, the assessments are what they're buying their homes for, or not far off. So you'll see this again in Enfield, and you see it again in Mount Uniacke in some of the areas. Now, Mount Uniacke's a little bit different. You'll see it along the lakes, because a lot of those homes around the lakes have higher values. But in this case, there's no water, there's nothing. It's just they happen to be close to the corridor, and they've got no or very little cap, especially when you look at the newer section in the back. You've got no cap on those newer section homes. District 3, again, you've got a mixture of blues, yellows, and oranges, depending on where you are. Now, if you zoom into some of the subdivisions, you get to a little bit more of the dark oranges and whatnot, those higher tax burdens. But in each one of these, you'll see how the tax burden is distributed in these districts. And I think I had the... as you go through the tables, you can look. What the tables demonstrate is that 50% of Enfield's tax bills are over $3,000, while 6% of the northern region's tax bills exceed $3,000. And the same figures for Uniacke, Elmsdale, Lance, and Shubie and Milford are 32%, 35%, and 23% respectively. So you can see how there's a big discrepancy in the different tax burdens that you get across different districts. So District 4, again, you've got some blues along here. When you get into the village of Shubenacadie, you've got some more of those yellows and darker yellows. And some of these you see on here too. I'm not sure if this one or not, but some of them that I looked at in the Milford and Shubenacadie region and Nimel River region were farms. So a lot of those farms are in that $6,000 range if they have barns and whatnot on them that are being taxed. Councillor Rhino's district, you've got the highest amounts between $1,000 and $2,000, just over 400 or just under 430 accounts. So there's a lot of blues in the middle, and then you sort of get some of those yellows coming along the shore a little bit. District 6, same, you've got a lot of blues along the roadways, and then of course there's the larger forestry section in District 6 that is taxed based on your 26 cents or 52 cents, depending on who the woodlot owner is. But that is certainly a large area of wood producing in East Hants. District 7, you'll see a lot of the subdivisions throughout Councillor Tingley's district in that $3,000 to $4,000 range. And again, you can look at these, you can zoom in on them, you can sort of start to look at where the roads are. You know, you say, okay, there's Robert Scott Drive. A lot of those people are in that $3,000 to $4,000 range. You can start to look down some of the roads, and we have this information in sort of better, you can zoom in a little bit better too, but I cut and paste for this report. So District 8, this is where you sort of see some of the darker around the lakes in those areas. And then sort of more of that yellow, the $2,000 to $4,000 range for District 8. Most of their, you know, sort of between 1,000 and 4,000 is where most of their stuff lies. District 9, again, you've got some areas around here that are sort of darker, those higher burden homes, and then you've got a lot in that $3,000 to $4,000 range. District 10, this is Councillor Eisner's district. Again, here's one of those around the lake that you've got all the 6,000 plus bills, and those would all be single family homes around the lake. And then you've got a lot in his district that are in that $3,000 to $5,000 range in those yellow colors. And then District 11, again, you've got sort of a mixture in District 11. You've got some from each of the color ranges. And again, you can take a look and see on your own the majority between that $1,000 and $3,000 tax burden for District 11. So just if you allow me to scroll through here, I know I hate scrolling on the screen when people are watching it, but so when I looked at all of that and hearing what council has said up to this point in your deliberations, I looked at 3 different scenarios, and again, these are really a starting point for any discussion that you might have. So scenario 1 just takes 1 cent and allocates it to Uniacke and to 9 Mile River and Enfield District streetlight rates. So that would cost the general tax rate $104,000, and you could also reduce the general tax rate by $391,000 or 1.58 cents. And that would be for everybody, including the folks that are in Uniacke, 9 Mile River, and Enfield Grand Lake. Scenario 2 would look at the same 3. So I should just back up for a second. So these 3 areas, when you look at the map of East Hants, are the 3 large areas that aren't represented in any of the current operating grants you have. So the corridor where you have serviced area, and then just outside of those, all of those taxpayers are impacted in some way, both commercial, residential, and resource, through the detransfer tax grant to the urban service rate. And then that northern area, that's where all of the fire departments who are less than $94 million in assessment are all in that geographic area. These 3 areas are the 3 that are not. So that's why I focused on these 3. Scenario 2 looks at allocating 2 cents to Uniacke, 2 cents to 9 Mile River and Enfield District. When I look at that and I look at the data that we just reviewed, you're getting sort of close to that equality of where those 3 areas are. This would cost you $208,000 on your general tax rate, and then you could reduce your general tax rate by 1.16 cents. And the third scenario is the scenario that, based on all of the data that I've looked at, and there's no special formula, this is just sort of looking at all those different elements that we've just reviewed. This is the one that I would recommend as a starting point for your discussion, and that would be to allocate the equivalent of 2.5 cents to Uniac and then 2 cents to the 9 Mile River and Enfield District 10 streetlight rates. So that would cost you just under 1 cent, $237,000 on your general tax rate. And then you would have, for all intents and purposes, a cent, 1.04 cents, to reduce your general tax rate for everybody that has the tax burden across the board. So that would lower your general tax rate. And that would help everybody with their growth and assessment this year, and sort of work that through your general tax bills. So based on tables 1 through 4 in the data, this would be my recommended scenario. This would give $143,000 to the Uniac Growth Management Reserve, and I'm assuming that's what the councillors of the area would want to start, is some kind of growth management reserve that you could use for preliminary costs related to sidewalks or cluster septic systems or whatever it is that our studies will tell us. And then reducing the Enfield and 9 Mile River street light rates by 2 cents each, and the numbers are there respectively. So if council chose to do that, the other recommendation that Wade made in the first report was that you would put these amounts into a grant, your budget policy, so that staff use council's direction each year to draft the budget. One of the concerns that the warden specifically mentioned with that was, well, what if you're giving this money as grants and then we need to increase the tax rate? We wouldn't want to do that. So these would just be amounts that were in the draft budget, and your policy could say that should the draft budget propose an increase, that these grants would be the first thing to sort of come off the table. And then you could look at where you go from there. And of course, the council of the day would have to go through that deliberation just like you would today. There's an alternative to just saying that these are the amounts and they grow by CPI. That is typically how we do most of our policies. You could say that there would be an equivalent of 2 cents or 1 cent or whatever the cent is in your policy, and then those grants would grow by that amount. The issue with that is if you're, and I guess going back to the original recommendation that Wade made 4 reports ago, we would encourage you sort of to move this away from being tied to the de-transfer tax, because although that might be where the money's coming from, eventually they're just going to be grants. They're not necessarily de-transfer tax grants too. You can keep that language if you like. My recommendation would be you'd move away from that language and you'd go to something like a growth management grant. Call it what you like, but that's typically what these grants are accomplishing. And then of course your operating grants for your smaller fire departments is captured in your fire grant policy. So that's already been captured in policy. And that is increases by CPI each year, and the assessments increase by CPI each year as well. So, Mr. Chairman, that's a lot of information. I guess I would turn it over to committee for discussion.
Thank you, CAO. First up to speak, Warden Rolston.
We're trying.
It's turning.
Thank you. Several questions and comments. First, I just want to confirm, I was looking for Shubenacadie outside the service area here. So am I correct in assuming that those folks who would not receive the benefit of the urban service rate grant, we're figuring that $10,000 to the Sportsplex is going to look after them? Is that the assumption? That that's where they're getting their, like,
The folks outside of the corridor or the urban service rate would have the sidewalk or streetlight rate for Shubenacadie, and that would be part of the urban service rate. And then those folks who are up closer to sort of in that, I'm not sure if the Maitland Fire Department crosses over into Shubenacadie at all.
okay, I'll leave that for now. Looking at this, I'm gonna say, I was very disheartened this afternoon when I looked and saw that this discussion had reached the point where a grant or grants to rural fire departments that make up but a fraction of a cent on the general tax rate that have been in place since before I came to council, in recognition that in those rural areas, those fire departments are our medical first responders. We no longer have an ambulance in the area. So they not only provide fire protection, but they also are our medical emergency folks. And that fraction of a cent has now become part of this discussion. I was hurt, for lack of a better word. However, when you look at it from a purely financial point of view and take the people, the humanity out of it, it is a grant from the general tax rate, and I have no option but to accept that. Might not like it, but I have to accept it. So moving on from that, looking at the numbers, and there may be a percent or two off here, depending if you're using 3 million or what we brought in last year. But when you look at the numbers, the folks benefiting from the urban service rate grant brought in $1.387 million of the transfer tax, according to the charts. Now, giving back the proposed grant of $444,584 to the urban service rate means that that urban service rate is benefiting of, and like I said, depending on what numbers you use, but around 32% of what they bring in, indeed transfer tax, is being granted back to the urban service rate. And that's pretty straightforward math. So, why can't we do the same for the other places? I don't know why we're stuck on 2 cents. So if we went and we looked, for example, I don't have my notes very well organized here, but the Hants North, or the rural area, brings in $406,575 in detransfer tax. Let's give 32% of that amount back to those areas. Corridor Other brings in $727,143 in detransfer tax. Let's give 32% of that back to that area via whatever mechanism we settled on. And Mount Uniacke brings in $842,025. Let's put 32% of what they're bringing in back into their area. And that way, every area in the municipality is benefiting by the same formula, so to speak. And I know that some areas have much higher assessments and bring in a lot more money. Now, 32% of that lot more money is a lot more than 32% of a smaller amount in the rural area. But everybody would get 32% of what they contributed. The grand total of that would be $1,076,822. Now, subtract that from $3 million in detransfer tax, it still leaves almost $2 million there. So I don't know if that's something that folks might consider equitable. It would be very easy in the Mount Uniacke area and the rural area. And we rural folks, we get along pretty good. I mean, we would take our $130,104 and concern about the rural fire department grant could then move from the general tax to this transfer tax amount. And it would almost double if we had that much money to put into the fire departments. We could then give them a grant of over $20,000 instead of $11,000 by only spending 32% of what was raised in our area. I'll leave the Uniacke councilors speak to what, if they wanted to do, the growth management or whatever grant type thing, then 32% of their deed transfer tax, that's $269,000 that could be set aside, and that's a lot more than 143. But it just seemed to me, and I'm not going to take all the credit for it, but it seemed quite an alternative that might be something that everybody could live with if everybody got the same percentage back of what was raised in their area. It might not, the $130,000 that the rural area would get wouldn't lower our tax rate, that $130,000, but it would assist our fire departments, and there are 6 of them. And I think we get along well enough that we'd probably be content to take that $130,000, divide it by 6, and give every fire department an equal amount. But those are my comments for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Warden. Next up to speak, Councilor Rhino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kind of along the same lines as the warden. That fire grant was started way before deed transfer and way before I got here. And it was started because of the inequity in the system whereby it was all assessment based. But now the standards are there. There's minimum standards for firefighting. And a lot of the times, I'll give you an example, because now of these standards and the policy we created about trying to have new trucks replaced every so often, we're following that in Maitland right to pretty well the letter, and replacing our trucks, we have a cycle. But we haven't got a facility long enough or big enough really to house them. So we have to get custom-made trucks, which cost a big upgrade fortune now on a custom-made truck. We can't, by buying a new truck every 7th year, we can't afford to build a new building to take advantage of cheaper trucks or used trucks from the quarter area. So we're in a catch-22 situation. So we need that grant. And for me, while reading this report, to include, you guys are getting this, we're not gonna figure this in these scenarios. Yeah, I don't like that. I really don't, because I think it's 2 separate issues. That deed transfer come along, never come in until way after that thing. And I wanna point out, although the population difference in each area, a life for the fire department is a life. It doesn't matter where you live. It's just that you may need a lot more equipment when you have a bigger population. There is a standard, and we've got to try to stay to that. And I believe some of us are a little bit falling behind in that. So to be included in this is, like the warden said, it's kind of upsetting to have that there. I'm going to listen to the rest of what the council has to say, but I really think that what the warden has just put out there, I think it is worthy of more discussion, and I like to see it on paper because I like to have things on paper so I can study them. So that's my feelings right now. I'm just a little bit upset that these scenarios said more or less, you poor people you're getting your grants now. Never mind you know, we're not gonna include you in this, so that's the way it feels to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Rhino. Next up, Counselor Musa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, after looking at the 8 years growth by area, I hope everybody understand where I'm coming from, where I was pushing so hard to get something for, especially my district. It's by far the most grown district in East Hants with no investment from the municipality whatsoever. The only investment we have is paying $10,000, which I didn't know about, to the sportsplex, paying to the swimming pool, and paying to the urban service grant. That's the only investment we get from East Hants so far in my district. And the library probably, of course. So I think I 100% agree with the warden, like it's equitable to go that way, and to me probably it's not even enough, but I'll settle for it because I don't want to overkill. I want to be equal to everybody and no less than anybody. And I was gonna say something about the rural fire department, but I think the two councilors, they covered that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Next up, Counselor Garden Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you. You may or may not have noticed that the corridor councilors have been pretty quiet during all these deliberations. I think actually silent, other than Counselor Tingley, who spoke from a gazillion miles away. So you're proposing that 32% be distributed across the board, and that all these, the other numbers and the proposals be abolished and just go with 32% across the board?
I believe the proposal was the current grant given to the urban service rate is 32%
Yes.
of what the urban service rate catchment area brings in.
That's right.
So in every other area, they would be able to get their, whatever they bring in, 32% of that
Exactly.
stays in the area.
Yeah,
Yeah, and the rest then all goes to the general pot.
right. And so, yep, so that's what I'm just confirming, that, that all the rest of the proposals in this, if, let's say that, the warden, if we talk over, or if we decide on something like the warden is talking about, then it would just be the straight, percentage, everybody's percentage equal to that of, I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Okay, go ahead, Warden.
Yes, the simple answer is yes.
Yeah,
As I said, it would be very easy in the Mount Uniacke and in the rural areas to do that. It gets a little trickier in those areas that perhaps couldn't take their 32% and give it to their fire department, because their fire department crosses over urban service and non-urban service. But I think we have the ability to figure those numbers out and those rates and, make something work in those areas. I truly do. It might take some math, but I think we have the data that we would need to figure it out. Like, for example, Enfield, I think you could tell how much of the other non-service area folks, how much was being brought in, and the 32% of their amount would go to whatever area rate was decided, be it fire, street light, or whatever. I just think there's ways to do it. Thank you.
okay, I just wanted to make sure I was understanding what your idea was. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor McPhee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that kind of lastly, but that's what I was thinking. In District 4, we have the urban service rate, and then we have areas such as Mill Village, North Salem, where I live in Shubenacadie, we aren't on the urban service rate, so it would be kind of hard to divvy up. And then, of course, the farms make up such a big part of District 4 that kind of skews things. There's no deed transfer coming in off all the agricultural land. But with the proposal that the CAO put forward, the preferred proposal, I was thinking, how does that benefit the people are they getting a fair shake in Mill Village, North Salem? I don't see where they're really getting anything. Or myself, but we're all in the same boat. So I kind of looked like we were the people getting the least out of this. Didn't seem to be much advantage to the people in
I'll
part
let
of
the
my
CAO respond to how those areas possibly would be impacted. Go ahead, CAO.
So I think I'd have to look on a map to make sure, I kind of made some assumptions that some of those areas were covered by sort of the Maitland Fire Department or the
they're
urban
not.
service, the 2 cents or the 4 cents on the urban service rate from that
No,
old district
we're all
of
covered by
Shubenacadie.
the Shubenacadie District Fire Department.
And none of you were in the old district of Shubenacadie?
Pardon?
Were you all in the old district of Shubenacadie?
Where I live used to be Milford, in the district that was Milford.
So I'd have to look at where the pockets are, that there may be a small pocket in there that doesn't get charged the 2 cents or the 4 cents for streetlights or sidewalks. Those folks would be benefiting from the 1 cent decrease. That would be there are going to be pockets in every scenario that, I don't know how you do it with all of the old districts and the old rates and boundaries and whatnot. I'm not sure that we can get a cross coverage of all of them. But I know the districts of Milford and Shubenacadie, I think the older ones all had at least a 1 cent or 2 cents sidewalk rate on
Yeah,
them
we
for years.
all paid sidewalk, because when I was in the Milford section, I did, and then
Yeah,
when we became Shubenacadie section, yes, we paid the sidewalk and the sportsplex.
right, so that sidewalk rate is part of the urban service rate.
Yes. And what about the sportsplex?
Well, none of this would, the $10,000 is, it is an operating grant, but you could increase that amount for anyone who, you could somehow use the amount for the sportsplex. But, I mean, that $10,000 isn't it's not impacting their rate at all. That wouldn't impact the sportsplex rate to any great deal.
And then I don't know about the people, I doubt the people in North Salem paid the sidewalks.
Yeah, I don't
rate,
remember how
or
far
even
those two
Mill
old
Village.
districts.
I mean, I can see the sidewalks from my
Yeah.
house, but
Yeah.
I can see the water system from my house, but I
Yeah.
don't get any advantage out of it. Seems like, I don't know, it doesn't seem equitable the way that the proposal is for everybody in my district anyway, and I think that would spill over into other corridor districts, that they're not gonna get an equal advantage out of the tax reduction.
Well, again, I'd have to look at the map, but I think most of the people outside of Shubenacadie, outside of Milford, would get advantage, are already getting an advantage from the D-transfer tax urban service rate grant.
Okay, thank you.
Is that all, Council? Thank you. Next up is Councilor Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just trying to figure out where the 32% came from. If somebody could explain that,
That would be the 444,585,
on what,
which is the proposed urban service grant
from what amount it's collected?
from the D transfer tax out of the 1.387653 million. So you divide the 44585 by 1387653 and you get 0.32.
So the 41%, what's that mean?
That's the amount of the total D-transfer tax that's collected in that area, which is equivalent to the 1.387 million.
So the difference would go to the general tax rate to lower your general tax rate.
The 41% has no relationship to the 32%.
Okay.
It's the number that the 41% represents that was used to get to the 32%.
So it's 41% of the 3363?
Right.
Yes, that's what's proposed to go back with the urban service rate grant.
No, 32%.
32%, yeah.
Of the 1387653 is what the current proposal is for the urban service rate grant. That's what that equals, is 32% of that amount.
So of the amount that is collected in the detransfer tax, from the urban service rate area, 900 and some thousand would still stay as detransfer tax going to support the general tax rate.
Which is the same as it is now.
Okay. Okay, just trying to figure out the numbers and how it works. I'll get back to you. I'm still crunching the numbers.
Okay, next up, Counselor Rhino.
Yeah, I just want to clarify through you, if I may, Mr. Warden, so 32%, what the warden is saying, 32% districts 5, 6, and 11, 32% of 406,595, and 32% for the 727 for the other quarter, other, and 842,000 for 8 and 9.
32% of that.
32% of that. Now, the rest going on the general tax rate or into general tax rate reserves,
I
or?
assume that that would be a decision. Some would go into reserves and some would go towards the tax rate.
I'd like to
Whatever
see,
council decides.
yeah, it sounds good, but I'd like to see it on paper, and I wish you could have made a paper report for it.
I can lend you my notes.
Anyway, I'd like to see it on paper. That's, because I think it's worthy of discussion, more discussion, but I'd like to see it on paper, that's all.
Is that all, Counselor?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Hep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just, I guess, some clarification also. Harbor Land pay for the sidewalks in Milford. Would they be part of the urban service rate?
Depends on whether they, through you, Mr. Chairman, there's a line there somewhere where the old District of 9 Mile River ended. Some of those folks would be on the 9 Mile River streetlights. They were taken out of the urban service rate, and some would be on the urban service
Well, there
rate.
is no street lights in Harbor Land. There's a couple of lights at the end of the roads. That's about it.
So they would be 9 Mile River. They would be Milford on the urban service rate for streetlights, or for sidewalks.
The street lights is there, might be a half a dozen that would be there.
I think it's more 9 Mile that has the, up towards the intersections that have the,
Yeah.
they're part of the 9 Mile River streetlight rate.
Starts about the Garden Road.
Yeah.
But the Harbor Land people, they pay for the sidewalks in
Yeah.
Milford.
So they're on the urban service
They
rate.
would be on the urban service rate,
Yeah.
okay? The second question is 32% to go to these districts and stuff. It sounds like they're gonna go towards the fire departments. Do I understand that?
That's a decision to be made. That's where I would like to see rural go. Mount Uniacke probably towards the recreational or future planning project reserve.
So I'm just wondering, in 9 Mile River now, is that considered rural? Is it, what is it considered? That's,
Through you, Madam, or Mr. Chair, the 9 Mile River streetlight rate and the Enfield streetlight rate would be two areas where you could put some funding, but there would be other amounts that sort of like trying to think where those others would be. They would be anything in district, like in Counselor, if there's people that don't pay, but they're in that district for Shubenacadie, you'd have to find some way to get that money back to them.
well, like in 9 Mile River, all 9 Mile River is streetlights.
Yeah, so those two
So-
areas are easy. The Enfield
Yes.
area and the 9 Mile River area, they have their own streetlight rate.
Okay,
So you could reduce that rate by 2 cents or 3 cents or whatever. The report recommends you reduce it by 2 cents.
right.
But if they got $232,000, then, you could wipe out their streetlight, I
Well,
guess, and just
whatever,
pay for it or
whatever works
whatever.
out there, yeah. Okay, no, I just needed the clarification. That's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Hep. Seeing nobody left to speak, I'm going to turn the chair over to the warden. Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines as the warden, doing the math and like, when we look at the history of the last at least 7 to 8 years of the D transfer tax. The only concern that I would even have would be, are the numbers sustainable for the future going forward in all the areas? And looking at Viewpoint and some of the other real estate things, I think we can expect to see these numbers continue to grow over the next number of years going forward. So it would then continue to boost the grant going to the urban service rate. It would help out the rural fire departments, and in Mount Uniac, we would be looking to start some of that, as the CIO said, seed money for infrastructure, because we do know we have a substation being planned right now. That's a $7 million project, right? The community center is being talked about. Sidewalks are being talked about. And all of these things are going to require funding in the future. And any money that we can have to prepare for those projects without having to go directly to debenture, I think is only beneficial for not only Mount Uniac, but the municipality as a whole. The old adage, build it and they will come, well, that's what worked in this area, and that's going to be the next step for Mount Uniac. They're already coming, they just need to start, getting some things. So I would see myself, that's where I see it would go. It would go to some form of infrastructure reserve that can be used for all of those different things that I mentioned, because depending upon, when you're looking at some of these infrastructure projects, as we've seen here around the council chambers, if you have $200,000, that can turn to $600,000 pretty quick if you get the one-third between the federal and provincial, right? And, a lot of the grants and a lot of the big announcements we've had for water mains and stuff, this is $7-10 million of funding that's gone. That's also helped, infrastructure and different things. So I think it's only beneficial. And as the warden put it very well, it's, if you're looking for fair, 32% of a little is 32%. 32% of a lot is a lot. And that way there, it kind of keeps everything even. Now, the numbers will never be even, we know that, but at least the benefit will be there. And when it comes to the corridor other, which encompasses a lot of areas that have been identified by, the other councilors here, the money will be there, and then maybe it does allow for more sidewalks in the future or other things. And that would be up to, as we have meetings every year and we talk about what the goals are for each district and priorities when we, before we start doing capital budgets and stuff, that would be some areas where there might increase some flexibility in those districts to be able to get things done. That would be, if I was a counselor for that area, that's what I'd be kind of looking at, is it might provide me more flexibility, because if we only have streetlights and some sidewalks and we can lower those rates, it's instant, and there's money left over, well, now you're creating seed money for something else, because we do know Shuby and Milford is the next area to push through. Now that Lance is being pretty much planned out, that's just the next natural progression. So that's where I see this being long-term a benefit for the whole municipality, not just only my district, but I don't know, and it would have to come back policy-wise if we can tie policy to percentages and as assessment goes up by CPI, we don't have to add CPI every year to that, because that 32% will increase by CPI based upon whatever comes in. Or drop, right? This way here would protect it against dropping, actually, because if we're always seeing an upward swing, and maybe it would then give the flexibility that if at some point we became into a situation that the D-transfer tax was dropping, right? That crucial portion of a reserve, like this, basically, I think under this plan, 1/3, because it's 32% across the board, 1/3 of the D-transfer tax we take in would go back to the residents, and then 2/3 would be left for reserves and whatever other project and general tax are there. So we'd be able to insulate ourselves over a number of years to kind of ebb and flow out any rise and falls. And that's just my thoughts, but it's definitely something I think worth having discussion and looking at and investigating the feasibility of it. Thank you.
And just before I turn the chair back over to Counselor Perry, I want to say I didn't come up with this brainwave all on my own. I give a lot of credit to the gentleman beside me. And the minute that we're in a discussion and he looked at numbers and, we can't, well, it's 32% or somewhere there. And my mind took off, and I think his mind took off in the same direction. So I don't want to take credit for coming up with this all by myself, because I was pretty depressed this afternoon, I'll have to tell you. And I'm not so bad anymore. Anyway, back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Warden. Next up to speak, Councillor Rhino. It's coming, Keith. There you go.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going over some facts and figures here in this 32%. I think it's proportional. But I'm more interested, if we go with that, we've got to decide, are we gonna put the rest of this to the general tax rate to lower that tax rate? Or are we gonna put reserve or what? I think that's what, it sounds like, and I may be stepping out here, that everybody is kind of half agreeing with the proposal that was put out here tonight. But what are we gonna do with the rest of it? I'd like to see to lower that tax rate. So I guess that will be the next decision we're gonna have to make. Are we gonna reserve some of that, or are we gonna lower that rate, or what are we gonna do? And that's where I think maybe this should come back again with those exact numbers going to each and what we could do there with regard to that. So.
Thank you, Councillor. CAO, I'll let you respond. Here you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to Councillor Rhino's question, just doing some quick math, and I'd like to, Shirley, to put the report up on the screen maybe so I can use my spreadsheets. If you kept the recommendation of putting some money to reserves for building and properties, which I truly believe you have to do, because you're going to, anyway, the recommendation is there to put the $381,000 or 13% of that to a reserve. You'd increase your general tax rate by 0.27 of a cents to go with this plan. So you could take some more of that money out of reserve or not put it to reserve. But that municipal buildings and properties, like, you're going to need some pretty major things in your general tax rate expenditures in the next few years. So to putting that reserve and setting that aside is really crucial to how you're going to be able to do things in the next few years. And as we see things grow, you're going to have more money coming in for your general tax rate, but part of your idea for growth and part of the investment of infrastructure to drive that growth is so you can reduce that tax rate over time. And going back and looking at some of those older reports, like, we used to have a tax rate here, a general tax rate of 96 cents. So over the years, as your assessment has grown, you've decreased that general tax rate, which is really matched, sort of those, maybe not matched for individual homeowners, but that's the whole idea of the growth that we're seeing, and you're in a fortunate position that you've got that growth. But you're still going to need to put money aside for reserves for buildings and properties, which we're not setting enough money aside for at this point.
Thank you, CAO. Next up to speak, Councillor Mitchell.
Yes, going back to the 32%, I just want to get clarification. Is that based on the 430? That was a third of the 1387?
No, it's based on the 44585, which is proposed for this year.
Okay. And the second question is, could some of the deed transfer tax go to keep the sportsplex going? in the interim?
That's up for a discussion on council.
Okay,
But it would have to be a proposal from a counselor to look at that, and then we'd go to discussion. That's what we're here for budget, so. But
just a question, I wanted to see if it's gonna keep open, or since they were here looking for almost 700,000 to get to the end, so. Just a thought, hopefully councilors will keep it in mind, since it's our asset. That's all, Mr. Chair.
thank you, Counselor. Counselor Musa.
I kind of forgot what I want to say. Oh. Can
Okay, I'll come back to you, Counselor. Warden Rolston.
Now, just a question. Currently, after the after the urban service grant is given from the deed transfer tax, what happens to the rest of the deed transfer tax currently?
That detransfer tax is general revenue, so it's used to lower your general tax rate. If you didn't have it, so for example, your budget of 3.2 million, if you didn't have that detransfer tax, it's 12, 13 cents on your general tax rate, so
I
it
guess-
lowers that general tax rate.
I guess the point being that the approximately $2 million left over after the 32% thing is not an extra $2 million to lower the tax rate. That's part of what we would be doing anyway. So the question is, if we want to lower the tax rate further than what we have, we would have to decide what, if anything, could be put into reserves.
Is that all, Warden?
Yeah.
Counselor Musa, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was gonna say to Councilor Rhino that we cannot do, like, in my opinion, we cannot do both, like, give a grant and lower the general tax rate. So the grant you get to the fire department, you could use it to lower your fire rate at the same as you lower the general tax rate, like the extra money you get. That's how I see it, because we cannot do both. We gotta do one or the other. I don't know if that makes sense, or like for us, the grant, we could take it, and instead of lowering the whole general tax rate, we could give it to our fire department and lower the rate by 2 or 3 cents. And you could do the same in your area, unless your fire department need more money. So that's how I see it, like, because if we lower, there's no money to lower the general tax rate if we take all that. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Rhino.
Well, I appreciate that, my counterpart across the floor. So the total deed transfer taxes is $3,363,000, correct?
Yes,
Total tax collected.
last year.
So if we go with the scenario tonight, how much money would that be with the tax, with the urban service rate grant, and the proposal that was proposed here tonight? So what would that leave?
It comes down
To deal with?
It comes down to the question the CAO brought up was, we have earmarked for 381,000 to go to reserve, right, for already, and what's left over, because they've already calculated the money into the tax rate currently. So this proposal, I believe, and I'll let the CAO speak, actually increases the general tax rate.
Well, I like to see, I'm a visual person, and I like to see, I'm trying to get the numbers to write them down here so I can see it and study it, right? And this is what I think we're missing here. But I think, I don't know, we should be able to do something without increasing that general tax rate. That's what, I don't want to increase it. I want to try to make this half equitable and not increase that tax rate, so maybe there's further discussions gonna be had again. But I just like to have some facts and figures so I can get on paper here, so.
Thank you, Counselor. CAO.
So I guess the question is, one of the things that you'd have to decide is, so the numbers that are being thrown around here are 32%. Well, these are 32% of 3.3 million, which are last year's numbers. So each year going forward, do you want to look a year back and say the grant's going to be 32% of last year's numbers in this year's budget? Do you know what I mean? Like, you can't, you could say it's 32% of the budget, the proposed budget, but like, you need some way to justify. So using these numbers, if you said 32%, what you're gonna have to look at is you're increasing, I think you've all decided that you're comfortable increasing your D-transfer tax budget from 2.123, which is in your draft, up to 3 million. So you've got $877,000 to work with. Of that, how much do you want to allocate out to the different areas? How much do you want to put into reserve? And how much do you want to use to reduce your tax rate?
But is that 800 and some after the urban service rate grant? It doesn't come out of that.
No, that's after, so you, assuming that's still going to be there, you need to pay the other 3 grants out of that 877,000. So if you keep the amount going as recommended here to reserves, then you'd need to increase your general tax rate to do that. If you lower that amount going to reserves, you could do nothing to your general tax rate. You could sort of make whatever that amount be equal. If you want to decrease your general tax rate, then you either have to decrease the grants that are given, or you have to decrease the amount you put in reserve. Those are your only 2 choices. Because there's only $877,000 increase available to be spent, unless you want to increase your general tax rate.
All right, next up to speak, Counselor Musa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So instead of going with last year transfer tax, why don't we get told what is available this year so far without the month of March? Like, we should know exactly how much we already collected, and we go from there probably.
We have until the end of January collected.
Okay, so.
And the issue with moving forward with something that's more sustainable is we start to pull these numbers together in November, December. Like, we don't have the benefit of even having December's numbers when we put the budget together.
Okay, so
So-
we don't know right now how much up to January?
No, just up to the end of January, we probably just got those in, because we don't collect them here. We collect, the
Yeah.
province collects them and gives them to
Yeah.
us.
So any rough idea what we already dealing with, like, so far? 2.9.
2.9. But I guess what I'm trying to come to is a way that you can every year have a number to base your budget on.
So
for
how
these
about we base it on end of December, and we leave 3 months for the extra? Probably we could do that. If we know how much till end of December every year before budget, and at least we know ballpark what our minimum is, then if we get extra, it could go to reserve, or it could go to something. I don't know if that makes sense, but at least we know, like, what
There wouldn't be any extra because,
those low months, I know.
well, no, I mean, there wouldn't be any extra because eventually you have to get in a cycle of what, like, it would just be your budget, right? So you would give, if it was 32% of April to December, then that amount would be your budget, and the next year you do the same. So that money would just go to the general tax rate.
at least we know we're not gonna have like deficit in a D-transfer tax, like minimum, like if you have a minimum that you work with, it will be better for our tax. And also, I like to point something, if we didn't go with the 24-hour police, we could have lowered the tax way more, but those expenses they have to come from somebody, so, thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. Next up, Warden Rolston.
The other thing we could do, and I mean, getting these numbers, we used the numbers that we had in the report that were available to us. But they're scalable. I mean, the total collected in the urban service rate area was 1,387,653 last year. And that's coming out of a total of 3,363,396. So if our budget amount is going to be 3 million that we're budgeting, not 3,363,396, all those collected numbers are scalable according to that. And but, you know, the percentages aren't going to change a great deal, or the amounts. And you would have to decide then if you're going to hold your deed transfer, or your urban service grant at 430,800, or if you're going to increase it by CPI this year, or if you're going to hold it and do the increases after we put a policy in. But if you based it on budgeted amounts and you stayed with the 430,800 and divided that by 3 million, I don't know what the percent is that comes up there. Or if you go with the 444,595 out of 3 million, that's a higher percent than 32 if you do it out of budgeted amounts instead of last year's actual. But I mean, certainly it's scalable that way. But I think when I do the math with the 877,000, adding the extra grants based on the 32% that we talked about, total 632,210, which leaves $244,790, which could either go to reserves or reduce the general tax rate or split it between or whatever for this year. Or at least that's the math I came up with. Thank you.
Thank you, Warden. Do you want to speak, CO? Go ahead,
Through
CO.
you, Mr. Chair. So the amount that I have is 563,000 that you would need for the 3 grants, assuming that the portion of the northern grant would pay for the fire department loan. So that would be, instead of 61,000. Do you know what I mean? Like, when you first mentioned that, you said that you would cover the grants out of that amount. So you'd only need 563,000. Which, again, is more than the 495, which is that 2-cent amount that we were working with. You can scale it up or down, but to me, it's,
Go ahead, Warden.
I'm
Reply
just
to-
going by the totals of taking the 32% for each area.
But you just forgot to remove the 69,000 from the grant. 'Cause you said you were going to cover that with the 32% in your proposal.
Yeah, but that doesn't affect the 32% number.
No, but if
No.
that number would,
but it would come out of the general tax
Go to
rate
the
and
general
go out of
tax rate.
these instead.
yeah,
Yeah, so it would
So it would impact the general tax rate.
reduce the general tax rate.
Right.
Okay.
okay. Counselor Garden-Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just have a few questions that I need to get straightened out in my head. So last year, when we did last year's budget, so we're working with last year's numbers.
For the deed transfer tax, yes, because we don't have a crystal ball to know what's going to come this
Exactly.
fiscal.
Okay, so just give me a second here to compose myself. So the 32% divvied up amongst everyone, plus the grant to the urban service rate, means that we would be adding to the general tax rate if we were to do that.
According to what the CIO just said, not necessarily. So basically, the 32% is what the urban service rate is getting now. right? They get to keep the people who pay into the urban service rate, the deed transfer tax from that area, they get to claw back 32%.
Get that.
So the proposal is everybody should get to claw back that
Yes.
same amount.
Yeah.
Right? From that, also in the warden's proposal, was that moving to this model, the general tax rate would no longer pay those fire grants. It would be covered under the 32% because instead of receiving $11,000, I believe the warden said
69 something in total.
69,000 in total
Yeah.
would come off the general rate. And the fire departments would actually receive over $20,000. So they would receive a substantial increase in their total amount.
Right?
And it would save the general rate in that way. But what the numbers the CAO said, out of the 800 and some odd thousand that was left over, 500 and, sorry, CAO,
63.
563 would be taken up in this new proposal.
Yes.
And then the remainder, the difference between 563 and the 8, is whether we can reduce the tax rate or increase what we put to reserves.
Okay. So if we were to put in what was recommended into reserves, then we would actually be
Increase your tax.
increasing the general tax rate.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I wanted to confirm.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Rana.
Did I just hear through your explanation to my fellow counselor beside me that the elimination of the grant to the fire departments?
No,
This is very confusing, and I'm not scared of it.
so it's, what the warden proposed was, the grant that currently is on the general tax rate, moving to this model, the grant wouldn't have to come off the general tax rate because the money coming from her proposed model would actually give the fire departments more than the grant.
That would move over to the deed transfer tax from the general tax rate.
What,
Shirley, can you put my
32%
screen up,
of
please?
406,575?
It's only $69,000 would come, and then the rest of it could also go to the fire department.
So counselors, if you can look at the numbers up here. So this is the table that's in the report. So based on this number, the urban service rate got 430,000, which is 31%. 32 if you use
This year's
the
projected
444. So 32% of that amount that was collected in the corridor outside of the serviced area would be $232,000. What you would do with that, you could reduce your Nine Mile River lights, you could reduce your Enfield lights, and then there's a pocket of individuals, how I'm not sure, we'd have to do some mapping to figure out who needs to be included in that. For the northern area, you would have 32% of the $406,000 less the $69,000 that the general tax rate gives to the fire departments. So you would have an additional $61,000 to call what you like. The fire, you've got a fire capital grant, a rural fire capital grant fund that you could put it into. You could lower your rates in the fire areas. You could give them another operating grant, whatever that looks like, but it would impact the general tax rate by $61,000. And then the UNIAC is 32% of the $842,000, and that amount of money could go into a reserve for whatever you wanted.
I'm still confused.
So
Go back to that 406,575. And 32% of that's 130,000, correct?
right.
But I'm hearing, how is that gonna give the fire departments more money?
So it's $132,000 that would go to the rural area.
Right,
Okay, so, but of that, you already give a grant of $69,000. So that has
Of
to
how
be-
much?
Of 69,000. The 6 grants that are given out
oh, total,
total
all right,
equals
so,
69,000.
all
So
right.
that would be covered still by the general rate. This grant of the 32% would be reduced by that amount. So you get an extra $61,000 to allocate however you liked.
Yeah, yeah.
That's like, holy moly.
No, no.
Why not?
Well, I wouldn't say that would still be covered by the general rate. I would move that to the deed transfer, the same as the urban service rate is, out of our share of deed transfer.
However you look at it,
Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah.
It ends up being the same.
But it gets confusing if you say it's staying on the general rate, because I understood that that was part of the problem, that we were getting a grant from the general rate. So,
however, so you would benefit, the general rate would get the $69,000 back and it would be paid for out of this rate. That 69 is not part of the extra, there's not an extra 69 being paid out. And then the UNIAC would be the 269. So the total of that, of those three amounts, is $563, and that would have to be paid out of the $877,000 uptick that you're proposing to increase your detransfer tax budget by. That leaves $313,000 to be transferred to reserves. The recommendation was $381. Originally, I would have put more than that to the reserve for your buildings and properties, because you're going to need it. But that's entirely up to you. So if you wanted to reduce everything and just put $313,000 into your reserve, then you don't have to do anything to the general tax rate.
So on just roughly, what is there, 6 fire departments in the rural area? So I took 130 and divided that by 6, and I get about 21,000 apiece. So we'd get 21,000, and then we would forego the emergency grant of, what is it, 6,900 or something per department?
11,506.
Or 11,000, whatever. We'd forego that,
no,
or it'll be
it's wrong.
in
We're just
additional.
moving it. We're moving it from the general tax rate into our 32% of the deed transfer tax amount, so it's no longer on the general tax rate. The departments are still gonna get it. It's just being allocated from our share of a deed transfer tax.
Right, so they would get 21,684
And there'd
each.
be an extra $10,000 available to go to them if we use the fire rates out of our 32%.
I'm still somewhat confused.
So the alternative is also you can keep giving them the grant, but reduce their rate by 1 cent or 2 cents, but give the fire departments the money through this mechanism. So it's really up to you whether the fire department gets actually more cash or whether you reduce your fire rates. That's a question that you folks can answer. In the interim, you could put it into a reserve and you three could decide, or you could decide after the election, or, there's all kinds of ways you can do it, but council has the ability to park these funds in a reserve until they have a use for them.
I think this still has to be put to paper for me too, and I'll have to discuss it further with my colleagues, because there's a portion of it I'm not getting. And anyway, I'm not against it, but I just want to understand before we vote on it, right?
All right, Counselor Rhino, I'll
Thank you.
come back to you then, later. Warden Rolston.
Yeah, and ideally, we would want to put as much to reserves as we can. I remind folks, this is just year one of something we're trying to get hammered out so that we don't have to do this every year. And so maybe in year one, we don't put as much in reserves as we'd like to. Maybe we put the 313,000 in and say, well, that's what we'll do for this year. Next year, we'll see. We'll get a pattern as we go down the road and see, and maybe, don't shoot the messenger, but maybe you put 250,000 in reserves and use the rest to reduce a fraction of a cent on the rate, or whatever you want it to do. You can split that 313,798 however you want, to reserves or to reducing tax rate. If we can hold the tax rate, I'd be content to put it in reserves, but that would be a decision of council. Thank you.
Thank you, Warden. Counselor Hep.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. if you see smoke coming from me, don't call the fire department. Trying to cipher this out. If we take the 32%, distribute it to the municipality, so that works out to about roughly 2 cents on each one, roughly, give or take. So,
No, it's probably more than that.
well, I'm just using 2%. So if it goes to the rural area, they use that for the fire departments. For my area and Tommy's, whatever, it could go to the street lights and stuff. So that's basically a reduction in 2 cents in the taxes, would it not be?
Or more, depending upon.
Well, or
Yeah.
more, is what I'm saying. So if that,
The tax
if
burden,
that,
yes.
if that holds that at the tax rate it is, and yes, I'd like to see more put in the reserve, but 313, I would sooner see that put in the reserve than to lower the general tax rate even more. I think we're doing due diligence by, it's not saying we're lowering the general tax rate, but in reality, we actually are because we're distributing the money there, if you follow what I'm saying. So I would be quite happy to hold the tax rate the way it is, knowing that there is gonna be a 2% roughly, give or take,
Benefit to
of decrease, a benefit to all the municipality. Am I clear on that, or did I confuse myself again?
No, no.
Through you, the 2 cents, the Enfield fire, or the Enfield streetlight rates could be reduced, the 9 Mile River rates could be reduced. The urban service rate folks would see no reduction in their tax rates at all. And I think their rate is going up by half a cent.
They would see the reduction from the urban service rate grant.
No, not from their current rate, because it's currently in there.
Yeah, but we're not taking that away from them. They're keeping that grant.
Right, but you're increasing your D-transfer tax budget by $800,000, and that group of folks are not going to see a benefit from that increase from what they have now.
But
So I agree that there's other people that don't have it and all of those things. I'm just saying, the Counselor Hebb suggested that everyone was going to see a benefit. The urban service rate folks are not going to see any change to their tax rate based on this scenario.
no, because they've been receiving a benefit.
No doubt, but
20 years.
he's indicated that everyone would receive a benefit, and I just want to clarify that they won't. You won't see that general tax rate reduction or any tax rate reduction for the urban service rate folks, and you're increasing your D-transfer tax budget by, almost a third.
But already built into the budget is a 5-cent reduction for the urban service rate.
Theirs works out to be 3.8 cents right now.
Reduction with the grant. Like the grant that they're being given reduces their taxes by 3.8 cents.
It does now, yes.
So they are receiving a benefit under this plan, because this plan,
They are, but they're not, their tax burden is not changing this year. I just wanted to clarify for Councillor Hebb, because he said everyone's gonna see a reduction in their tax rate. Those folks aren't. Depending on what the folks in Mount Uniacke do, they might not, but that's up to you, to the councillors of the area. And then there's going to be part of this $700,000 that I have to figure out who benefits from that and how you get that into the highest and best use of that. I'm not sure, because I have to talk to Councillor, I have to look the maps and see around the Shubenacadie area in particular, who's serviced by what fire departments and who's serviced by streetlights and sidewalks. I think they're all going to benefit from it, but I just have to double check that. Where that 727 should actually, or the 32% of it should actually go. But right off the top, I can tell you that the Enfield lights and the 9 Mile River lights could definitely benefit from that.
I'm gonna turn this over to the CAO, because I'd like to speak.
To the warden?
Or the warden,
To the
the
warden?
warden, sorry, warden, go ahead. So, under this proposal, it just makes it equitable, because since 2003, the urban service rate users have been supplemented by the D-transfer tax from the entire municipality, right? And it hasn't been just what they put in, they've been getting a portion from what everybody. Like if you go back and you look at the report, the first year they got 50% of the total. And when we look at the corridor and the urban service rate users, we realize now that Councillor Iser's district is in the corridor, but they don't have any urban service rate users. So I would care to guess at the original calculation of this, they probably used his assessment and his values as part of the calculation to say, look at how much more is in this area, as well as all the other areas that aren't part of the urban service rate at the time. That's just because everything the 6 years I've been on council, it's always been the corridor is one, it's 63%. Well, we see now, as we break it down, it's not 63%, it's 41% for the urban service rate users. So if you total up the lines from 2003 to 2024 with the grants, it's over $4 million the urban service rate users have gotten over the last 20 years from the D-transfer tax. So that one group of people has received that extra bonus, which, you know,
They're still gonna get this.
and they're still going to get it. It's going to maintain everything going forward. Because one of the options we had as a council and a decision to make is we could have just said, let's throw all the tax, the transfer tax, at the general and lower it by a certain number of cents, and it's fair for everybody that way. But it would have resulted in a larger increase to the urban service rate users. Keeping the grant still allows their urban service rate this year to decrease by 3.88 cents. So, I mean, and when you look at the D-transfer tax by area, the corridor other in Mount Uniac is 47%, right? There's 4 districts in the corridor that benefit, worth of people, that benefit from the urban service rate. And there's 4 districts between Mount Uniac and the corridor other that have 47% of the intake versus 41% of the intake. So when you look at that, it's kind of hard for me to look at a situation being equitable when you actually have the same number of people, the same number of districts actually bringing in more money and receiving no benefit from that D-transfer tax. Only one area is receiving the benefit. Under the warden's proposed plan, everybody receives the benefit based on their sizable scale. So the CAO is right. Immediately, according to the budget, they will see no difference. But if the grant ended, they would see an increase. So everybody does, as Councillor Hebb say, benefit because of all of these grants, not just a certain group. Because you look at 25% and 22%, that's 47 versus 41. And that's where, you, for me, equitable distribution of funds is not there. Because you could almost say, you know, those 2 areas are producing more, well, they are producing more money, but they're not, there's no money being put away for future infrastructure there. There's no money being away to support anything there. So we don't want to see the D-transfer grant go away because it is vital for those in the urban service area to keep that rate down. And this proposal, yes, it may mean less goes to reserves, but for the first time in 20 years since this program started, it will actually be an equitable distribution of the D-transfer tax, something that has never been done in 20 years. Because I would care to guess that the corridor was not separated, USR and other, when this grant started, and they included all those places. And as you can look at the maps, you know, in Elmsdale, the largest pot of money coming in from the black section, that they're on well and septic. They're not on the urban service rate out in Belknap. They receive no benefit from that grant going to the urban service rate. So it's one of those things that those people, as well as the ones in Uniac and all of the Enfield Grand Lake area, those people deserve to have something, you know, whether it's benefiting them by streetlights or by a reserve for future infrastructure programs in those areas. That's kind of been my thinking behind this whole thing is making it fair for everybody, because we are one municipality, and in the rural side, they might not bring in as much money, but you know, we all got to eat, and you know, those farms, their assessed value might not be that high, but we all know they're multi-million dollar businesses that employ people, that provide food and a lot of economic spin-off, as much as a business park does in a lot of ways. So we can't discount that. So when you look at the assessment there of 386 million, well, it's just, they're getting the same proportion that currently the urban service rate is already getting out of that, which they've never got before. So the first year, it is going to be kind of difficult, and it's going to be a bit of a challenge to get budgeted if we go this route. Like I say, we have to vote on this at some point. But like I said, for the first time in 20 years, it will be equitable. Everybody will be getting the same benefit, all citizens in all areas. Thank you, Ward. Councillor Garden Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I don't think anybody is disputing that. I think we're just trying to get our heads around what this would look like. To the CAO, you had mentioned that the urban service rate would not, the tax rate would stay the same for the urban service rate. Can you, sorry, but can you run that by me again? Why it doesn't change with the $444,000 grant, because that was already tied into it?
Yeah.
Okay, and how did that, so we're working with the number 32% because that 44,000 odd amount just happened to be 32% of the total,
Of
right?
what was collected last year.
Yes, okay. So that means that,
It's not necessarily what's going to be collected this year. So it's 32% of the 3.3 million that was collected last year.
right,
No, it's 32% of the
1387.
of the
Oh, sorry,
1.3
the
million.
one, whatever was collected last year, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, in that area.
Okay, so then we have to stick with the number 32% in order for this to work. Okay, that's it. So, I mean, I guess we're at the point right now at 10 to 9 where we, and I'm sure this was a lot of work, and we're going in a totally different direction than what, than what these propositions were, these proposals were going. But we're going to need to have numbers on everything that we've discussed here tonight with 32%. And because, as Councilor Rhino said, it's really hard to be thinking of this or making motions on this when it's not in front of us. That's my thoughts on it. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Next up, Councillor Rhino.
Another point of clarification. So, okay, so the total tax collected on the corridor urban service rate is $1,387,000, for
Yes.
rounded off.
Yeah.
So, would they be taking 32% of that?
That is what the current,
Now, just let,
Okay.
yes or no,
yes,
yes. All,
They already do.
would,
they already,
no, you see, answered yes, that's what, let me finish. So, that, the urban service rate grant would be eliminated, or would this be on top of it?
No,
That is it.
That is it.
That is the grant that's in the budget as drafted.
So that's all that they would be getting, that's what they would be getting, is 444,000. That
Right.
would, okay, so it's not on top of, that's it. Okay, thank you. But like I say, it's gotta be on paper when we gotta go through this again. Thank you.
Councillor Musa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just like to say that we're only doing budget for this year, and we can change it, or the other council can change it next year if it doesn't work. But we're trying to do something equitable, like I know Mount Uniac area is not gonna, the rate is, the general tax rate or any rate is gonna go down, but we have a big expense coming our way, same as the infrastructure you have here. We have some already 135 houses, and we have another 275 or 265 already in approval that are at least 35 minutes from our fire department. So we're looking for that fire station, and that's gonna be a big, huge expense. So like, the grant was given here for infrastructure, to support the growth or something, whatever it was given for. So we need to look at other areas. So maybe next time Nine Mile River need to expand their station. We should be looking at those big expenses that the federal government and their post-disaster, whatever, something they created, it's gonna destroy everybody who's gonna need a new fire station. So we're doing it for this year. We're putting the money aside. If it didn't work, we can change it next year.
Thank you, Counselor. CEO.
I just wanted some points of clarification. So Councillor Perry mentioned that Councillor Eisner's district has never benefited from this. Councillor Eisner's district was actually one of the reasons for this grant to go in place in the first place. So they benefited from it for a number of years until they broke off from the urban service rate. I think about the same time that Nine Mile River did. The other comment that was made is that, you know, the other areas have been subsidizing the urban service rate with this grant. So through the D-transfer tax numbers, that it has been coming out of those D-transfer tax. But if you look at the report, I don't want to leave anyone with the illusion that the urban service rate has been subsidized more than it subsidizes. So if you look at the urban service rate on your general tax rate, those folks who pay that area rate bring in 8.4 million of your $20 million general tax rate. So they're not subsidizing, they're not being subsidized by anybody. They might be out of the D-transfer tax, but they are certainly not being subsidized by anybody for their general tax rate portion. They pay 8.4 million of the $20 million in general tax rate. So I know it may seem like a nuance to some, but the reason this rate, and going back to the very first report, and like the reason or not, the reason this rate was put in place was because the corridor area, especially the serviced area, was and still does bring a tremendous amount of economic importance to this municipality. And it is paying a significant amount of your general tax rate. If you didn't have the growth that urban service rate is generating, your general tax rate would be much higher. There's no question it would be much higher. And those folks who are paying the urban service rate are paying those capital projects that are millions and millions of dollars. Even after you get grants in the door, there's still millions of dollars in order to generate that money. So there's been lots of arguments made as to why you would give grants to the other areas, and absolutely, Mount Uniacke is growing and is going to need money for infrastructure projects, no question. But to this point, that urban service rate grant has helped those residents who don't have any control over the growth in this area, has helped them keep that tax burden on their more highly assessed homes. You can see the burden is much higher on their homes than anyone else. It has helped them keep that down over the years. So I just wanted to make sure everybody's aware that this isn't the urban service rate is being subsidized by anybody else, because they're not. Of the D-transfer tax allocation, yes. The general grand scheme of things, absolutely not.
No, and with that number, the 4 districts, it's 4.2 million or 2.2 million per district. And so it's pretty much the exact same that Mount Uniacke has. Because if you were to double Mount Uniacke to have four districts, it'd be almost 7 million. Because we got to talk about when we talk about the corridor, you have to look at the numbers and the number of districts as well. Because if you group 6 out of 11, that number will always be higher than 1 or 2 out of 11. Councillor Rhino.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. When I heard the CAO speak, I thought I was in a time machine and went back several years. Because that is exactly how the counselors from the corridor area spoke back there years ago. And as I said before, it was, that grant was kind of an agreement. It was a realization that, yes, that small area produced that much money. It was a realization. So we realized that, give them the grant, we went back to a one-tier tax system. So that's how it was, and that's how the deal went down. So really to say subsidizing, I don't know if I won't agree with that neither. But it was just, you had to live it, you had to go through it, and you had to understand why it was created. And we did realize that the rural counselors that were and the Mount Uniacke counselors who were in this three-tier tax system realized that did realize what the CAO was said, that a great proportion is there. I'm not saying they're better than anybody else, I'm not saying, but it was a realization. So this was one of the things why we went to this grant thing, right? So it wasn't to subsidize them, it was just a realization to get away from that. So subsidization is not probably the proper term that I would use on that. Thank you.
Agree, Counselor. CAO.
Yeah, and through you, Mr. Chair, I'm not doing this I'm not saying any of that to cause any ill will, but when, and I'm not typically in the habit of arguing with the chair or correcting the chair when they say something, but when the subsidization word is used, I see eyes around the room going, oh, well, I didn't realize that. So I needed to clarify because that's just not the case in the overall picture. That wasn't the case. So I didn't mean any disrespect from that. That word is a very heavy word, and again, we haven't used it in a lot of years. So when it does get used, I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware that wasn't, in my opinion, they haven't been subsidized, maybe through the D-transfer tax, but not overall. They are not subsidized by anybody in this municipality.
And I would agree, they're not subsidized. Part of the thing comes from me is per district, by the numbers, Mount Uniacke is contributing the most to the general tax rate per district. Because it's 4.1 per district out of the 4 districts, and it's, or 2.1, and it's almost 2 in Mount Uniacke. And that's going to the general tax, and there's been, not a lot coming back in that area. So it's hard for our residents to see that we're paying our fair share and more than the serviced area towards the general tax, and then hearing that the general tax is receiving, the corridor area in the USR is receiving a grant to help offset some of their stuff. That's where it comes from for me. And if subsidy was the wrong word, if I use it, I apologize. It's equitable taxation is what I should be talking about. And it's just one of those things that I've heard over the last 3 months constantly from my residents, because for years in my area, they said we only pay our way, but we're paying our way and just as much as anybody else and more. And we haven't really complained or asked for anything, because we know every time that we do something, we've paid for it from our own funds. Most of the studies and stuff, like when we did a recreation study and we did this stuff, it came from our money. Oh, and we are at the hour of adjournment, so I'll stop there. There are 2 people on to speak. I will grant leeway to them. First up, Councillor Musa.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say, 8 years ago, it was a very good thing to do. Looking at the number now, we have to look at different distribution. We have to give every district their rights, whatever they need. And I don't agree that 8 million from 4 districts is better than 4.5 from 1 district, from 2 districts. mathematically, it doesn't fit with me. Probably 10 years old can think about it or can get it. I can't get it. When I look at number, I look at resident, how many resident in district. You have 1,700 homes, bring in more than 25% of the deed transfer tax and more than 20% of general tax rate. That's something on paper. We have to look at it. We have to deal with it, and I don't know what to say else.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Rhino.
Just very quickly, I just want to clarify, I wasn't chastising you for using the word subsidization. I just want to make you realize that for you or any other counselor coming in, that may have the appearance of that, but it really wasn't. Counselor, or the Warden Rolston and I were here for that, and it was just, like I'm not going over to explain it again, but it may appear that, but that's not what was. It was a realization of what it was. So I just wanted to make that clear. I wasn't chastising you, don't take it the wrong way. But for us, Warden and I being here, we have the history on it. So I just want to make, and like I say, yes, we may have to relook at distribution and how taxes are spent. I understand that, but that's done through consultation and talk here within the council chamber. So I just want to clarify that. Thank you.
No problem. We've reached the hour of adjournment. We've been going at things pretty steady here for budget. So there's two things we're going to need to do. We're going to need to set the next time and date of the next budget meeting. And we're also going to need to have a motion to possibly bring what we've talked about tonight back as a proposal and as a report. I would, as the chair, ask who would be willing to meet next Tuesday night rather than this following Thursday, because I believe we have council tomorrow night, and we've been going meeting after meeting after meeting, and I believe that staff and council need some time to digest. So I'd be looking to set the time and date for the next budget meeting on I think it's the 5th.
Is there a public?
Is there a public, there's no public information meeting? Okay. So for the 5th of March at 7 o'clock. So moved and seconded. All those in favor? Aye. Is there anybody looking to make the motion to bring what we discussed about tonight back as a report?
I move that this discussion tonight be placed in a report with the facts and figures that we talked about, so it's clarified to what the intent and how this would work, and to bring options on how we could keep the rate, not increasing the general rate. I don't know if that's clear enough, but
CAO, any questions for clarification?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, just a question. I can do the math on the 32% and bring that back and give you options on the general rate. That's no problem. I'm wondering if council would consider another option that would be easier to maintain long-term to put in the report. You don't have to commit to it. What I'd like to do is take the detransfer tax amount that goes to the urban service rate and figure out what it is as part of the general rate. I did the numbers fairly quickly. They look about the same, just because that would be easier to calculate. I think it's a little more for the rural folks, a little less for Nanaimo River, but within a few $1,000s. I need something that is long-term, easily to manage. So if I could just, without upsetting anybody, bring back another option in that report for you to look at.
so two options?
Two options.
Okay, but the option we talked about tonight, my intent of this motion is to make it clear. Here's what we're taking in, make it A, B, C. Here's what we're taking in, here's what we have to take out. Here's
Yep.
32% of this.
Yep.
Make it clear so everybody, it's foolproof to understand. And also bring us options of, on what's left after that 32% that we could either put in the reserve, try to keep the tax rate at where it is or whatever. That's my intent of the motion. If I didn't hear a seconder, but if they're good with what the CAO's, another proposal, I'll leave it to them.
So we have a motion on the floor. We have a motion made.
Motion made.
Is there anybody second it?
Second.
Seconded. Any discussion on the motion? Question, we'll go to the vote. And the motion's passed unanimously. Counselor Hebb.
Thank you. I would like to make a motion that the CAO bring up another option which he discussed, just for information purposes, nothing else.
I,
I think that was on the table.
it was already on the
motion,
table.
So I think we're good.
I think it'd be more clear if it was, if it wasn't part of that motion. It wasn't.
Oh, okay.
oh, okay.
There was no agreement between the movers.
Okay, the seconder didn't, okay.
Actually, his,
Yeah.
would be correct.
Might have agreed to it.
Okay,
Okay,
whichever.
so
I was gonna
Counselor
go-
Hebb makes a motion to bring back a second, option for information. Seconded by Counselor Musa. Any discussion? Question on the motion. We'll go to the vote. One person's left to vote. And the motion's passed unanimously. Move to adjourn. Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Aye.